Good morning. Our reading today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 45 to 56. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars, because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, I wonder how you would describe what your life has been like in 2020. For all of us, there have been what we might call ups and downs. No doubt at the beginning of the year, there were things that you'd planned that you'd just not been able to do. And if you tuned in to Chris G's reflection a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about just that, the plans we have that we've not been able to do during lockdown. Let me narrow the question down a bit though. If you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, what has your life been like this year as you've lived for Christ? Or more specifically, what have been the ups and downs as a follower of Jesus Christ? You see, as we look at the early chapters of Mark chapter 6, those disciples had ups and downs, a kind of roller coaster type of life following Jesus. All sorts of emotions, experiences and difficulties and struggles. For the disciples, beginning to follow Jesus, there'd been exciting things, seeing him perform all these miracles. And then there'd been what we might call a down, the questioning, then the threats of the religious leaders. And not forgetting, the disciples had the ups of listening to the amazing teaching of Jesus. They'd then been involved in ministry on behalf of Jesus, but as they went out, a bit of a downer in that some people didn't want to hear what they said. And as we thought last week, the disciples had experienced the pressures and tiredness of being in Christian service. Now, surely any believer can relate to those different experiences as a follower of Christ. For example, the excitement of being a new believer, rejoicing in all that Jesus has done for us, forgiving us, getting us into his family that we can call God our Father. But then sometimes questioning, sometimes opposition by people, even religious people. We have the privilege of being able to serve Jesus, but then finding that not everybody wants to listen to what we say. And then we find sometimes it can be tough just living for Christ. So as we turn to today's passage, this follows right on after the feeding of the 5,000. So Mark 6 verse 45, we read this. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. So why did Jesus do that? An amazing miracle's just happened. So why did Jesus then leave the crowds and then send the disciples away? Well, we're helped by looking at the parallel passage in John's Gospel, chapter 6. After the people saw that the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who's come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. There was a messianic zeal, a fervour from the crowds. The people didn't really understand what Jesus was doing, the purpose for him coming, and that seemed to have included some of the disciples. So Jesus sends the disciples away. Verse 45, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Now that word made is a strong word. It could be translated compelled, a very strong encouragement. It's a bit like if you've had children out for a day and they've loved something so much you can't get them in the car, they want to stay. We have to force them, compel them to go home. There's something of that. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. And then Jesus went to pray. Now this is a key moment. The crowd wanted to make him king. The crowd wanted to distract him from his purpose. So in a time of pressure, Jesus prayed. Now we're not told in Mark 6 specifically what Jesus prayed. But it's a reminder for us that even when things have gone really well, and even when people don't quite understand what we're doing, we need to pray. In fact, we need to pray all the times, but even after the great things that have happened. So we know that Jesus had much ahead. He knew what was ahead and he prayed. But we also know that Jesus knew exactly where the disciples were. We'll think more of that in a moment. And surely he was praying for them. And certainly in this passage he showed his concern for the disciples. Jesus prays for his followers, his people. Isn't that wonderful? And we know that's the case for us. Hebrews 7 verse 25, Jesus prays, Jesus intercedes now for us, his people. And how Jesus' first disciples needed his prayer and help at that particular time. As they headed across the Sea of Galilee, they were really struggling. Let me read from verse 47. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. John 6 verse 19 again, the parallel passage says that they were something like 3 or 3.5 miles from shore. And notice this was the fourth watch of the night. So the disciples have been rowing for something like 7 or 8 hours. Now they're not in the sort of danger that they were in chapter 4, where they thought they might drown. They were just exhausted and tired, rowing against a strong wind. And as we thought last week, being in ministry for Jesus, serving him, can sometimes just be tiring. As I think back, I know what it's like to be a youth leader, leading midweek, end of week activities. Sometimes it's a struggle just to get out of the door to do that activity, even though you know it's going to be good. We can be weary in the work. Not weary of the work, but weary in the work. And the first disciples at this point were tired and struggling. Why? And please do not miss this. They were tired and struggling because they'd done just what Jesus said. See, it's clear here. The disciples responded to Jesus. They had gone in the boat when he told them to. See, responding to Jesus can put us in situations that are hard, that are a struggle, that are tiring. Just ask our youth leaders, our house group leaders, those who lead Bible studies, how tiring it can be. I was chatting to a lady the other day from another church. This lady, Caroline, loves leading the Bible studies that she leads. But the preparation, the dealing with those for whom she cares, she finds really tiring. Yes, tiredness in Christian service can be a result of just listening to Jesus, responding to him. Those who follow Jesus can be weary when serving him. And we can end up in very hard situations that others who are not Christians do not face just because we're living for Jesus. Now, it is worth saying at this point that some of the television preachers on the television Christian channels or so-called Christian channels will sometimes suggest that if you follow Christ, that all will be well, all will be easy. It'll just be a breeze if only you have enough faith. And some of those preachers on the television, on YouTube, can sometimes suggest if you follow Jesus obediently enough, all will be well. Well, that's hardly the situation here, is it? The disciples had done just what Jesus said, and that's exactly why they were in a tough situation. Now let's get a balance here. Following what Jesus says, yes, can be tiring and tough, but it also brings an immense and wonderful joy. And maybe look at it this way. If you never climb a mountain, you'll never get aching legs, the tiredness from just climbing and climbing and climbing, but also you'll never get the joy of standing on the top and seeing the most wonderful views. So in the same way, if you never follow Christ, you'll miss some of the tough things, but you'll never know the thrill of being used in his service. And also, you'll never know what it is to be with him for eternity. So going back to those first disciples on the Sea of Galilee, it would have been so easy for them, wouldn't it, just to give up, to turn round, have the wind at their backs, and just row back to where they started. But please remember this, as the disciples were struggling, Jesus saw them. Verse 48. Jesus saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Really, you might say? Really? Really, verse 48? The disciples were about 3.5 miles out to sea in the Sea of Galilee. It was night. It would be like one of us standing on the top of Ivanhoe Beacon and looking towards, let's say, Cheddington. I don't know if you know anybody in Cheddington, but just imagine a family in Cheddington out in their garden on a rowing machine and really struggling from that distance in the middle of the night, and you can see the struggle. It's a long way. It's dark. Surely verse 48 means that Jesus saw in a divine sense, and Jesus clearly has a focus on those who are following him, those who have responded to what he said. Just think about that. Isn't that great? Isn't that special? If you are watching this as a follower of Jesus, if in any way you're having a tough time, Jesus sees. Jesus knows. As we thought earlier, Jesus is praying for you. Isn't that amazing? Jesus' followers here were having a tough time, and then Jesus went to them. Jesus walked on the water to them. Now, as I say that, I realise that many people, with the whole idea of Jesus walking on the water, they find that a bit of a joke. And certainly it's used as a form of mocking by some people. Through the years, I've known many believers who, when they mention they're Christians, somebody has said to them, oh, I guess you'll be walking on water next, or something like that. And the whole miracle has been played down. The illusionist known as Dynamo, a few years ago, walked, and I use that word loosely, on the River Thames for a TV special. It's on YouTube. There are 22 million views so far. Please don't stop this and just flick over straight away. But even if you look later at Dynamo walking on the River Thames, please also look at the YouTube upload which explains how Dynamo performed his illusion. There's a video that shows how he did it. He used special camera angles so that the watching crowd couldn't see exactly what Dynamo was walking on. And, a bit of a spoiler alert here, he wasn't actually walking on the water. But Jesus walked out 3.5 miles onto the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is much deeper than the edges of the River Thames. The edge of the River Thames, where incidentally Dynamo walked on a specially made support underneath, but that's another point. And what Jesus did all happened during the fourth watch of the night, about 3 a.m, the darkest part of the night, a time when these disciples were most tired. Jesus walked, and so his disciples could see him, so they would recognize him, and also so that they would know exactly who he is. See, I have no doubt that what Jesus was doing was to fulfill what is there in Job chapter 9 verse 8, which says, God alone treads on the waves of the sea. Jesus came so they could see him. Verse 49, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. So what happened? They were terrified. They saw what they thought was literally a phantom, a ghost in our terms. And why were they terrified? But they didn't expect to see him. And verse 52, they didn't understand the feeding of the 5,000. They didn't know what it meant. They didn't know that that meant that Jesus was exercising divine power, showing that he's God with all the power of God. In short, for the disciples at that time, their theology of Christ was not yet right, and that led to them being terrified. See, even in our own lives, we can doubt, we can hesitate, we can be unsure about Christ's identity, and that will lead us to being fearful. But notice what Jesus says. Jesus says, it is I. Literally, it is in the Greek ego eimi, I am. In Mark chapter 6 verse 50, Jesus spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I am, don't be afraid. Remember Exodus chapter 3, the Lord God introducing himself to Moses used those words, I am, therefore don't be afraid. See, when we see who Jesus is, that he's really God, we need not be afraid, not in the same way. because Jesus can take us through tough times as God. He'll be with us by his Spirit. So verse 51, then he climbed into the boat with them and the wind died down. And verse 53, they got to the other side with Jesus. So how did all this end? Interestingly, I've mentioned the parallel passage in Mark 6. In Matthew 14, verse 33, this parallel passage, the disciples worshipped Jesus. They said, truly, you are the Son of God. See, if we follow Christ, there will be hard times. But if we follow him, he sees us. He knows what we're going through. Not only that, he prays for us. And he comes to be with us by his Spirit in our situation. And as we reflect on this, we see that we learn more about Christ sometimes when we go through tough times, as these disciples did. As we go through tough times, our genuine response is to worship him, acknowledge him for who he is, and that he will use this to help us to grow as Christians and understand more about him. There's a new buzzword, or shall I say buzz phrase, amongst doctors, counsellors at the moment following COVID-19. The phrase is post-traumatic growth. Some doctors have been encouraging progress and growth after the tough things of COVID-19. Post-traumatic growth, what does it involve? Well, the article I read this week mentions 4 things. Firstly, an appreciation of life, the scenery, the blue skies. Secondly, relationships with others are appreciated, linking up with people post-lockdown and video calls with old friends. The third thing, people realise new possibilities and personal strength, the encouragement for people to see that they can get through things and can go forward. And the article also talked about a 4th thing, spiritual change. So PTG, post-traumatic growth, is a new buzzword. Or is it? Are people growing through and after struggles? Is that really so new? Well, Christians have known for 2,000 years very tough times in Christ's service. But like the first disciples, and as Peter, who was there, writes his letters, it mentions the struggles of living for Christ, but then growing as Christians. See, we can grow in appreciation of Christ as the one who is so wonderful comes alongside us. We can grow in our relationship with Christ and others as we look to him in difficult times. We can know new possibilities with Christ next to us. So yes, there can be Christian growth. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, through the ups, through the downs of recent times, through the struggles, the tough things, will we use this time to grow as Christians? Will we be praying that in a year's time, 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, that we'll look and say, Jesus, thank you for being with us in 2020. Thank you for being with us so that we grew in love for you. We grew in appreciation for you. We increased our ministry for you. And just notice from that how the passage ends. In the last section, it is people coming to Christ again. And may that be the outcome of our ups and downs, our struggles with Christ watching over us. And may that be our desire, our prayer. A wonderful passage we've looked at. May that encourage us through the rest of 2020, through the rest of our lives for Christ.